All right, so we are in week 3 of aesthetics, and so more than halfway through. And just by way of announcements, I do have your week 2 analysis grades and comments posted, and also the week 3 explorations done, which I always like to get done before the classes so I can use some of your examples on my slides. Really good book cover examples. By the way, and I don't know if it was you, Randy, that mentioned it back in week 1, that made a comment about book covers as layout designs, but whoever that was actually shaped that activity because that's where I got the idea. So that was an interesting brand new assignment that I had just added, and wasn't sure how it would work out, but it looks like it works out really well because some really good examples of typography or typefaces and visual hierarchy. So are there any questions or any concerns before I get into the material for this week? Okay. So we are talking about typography this week. Actually, there, that's the better slide. Actually, we're not really getting too much into typography as the discipline of typography. Typography is a pretty extensive subject that in some degree programs like our digital art and design program is a class unto itself and probably could fill multiple classes with all the various facets of it with spacing and leading and kerning and so on. Really, our interest right now is the visual style of typefaces more than anything else, because we are focused more on the storytelling, the personality, and the psychological aspects of creating a particular impression. So really, we're not getting into those technical aspects of typography. That will actually be a part of your graphic design course a little farther down the road. But right now we're looking at really setting the personality through typefaces. And let's see, I'm going to drop out of my slide presentation real quick to show you something that kind of gives some context to what we're doing. Hopefully you can see this, my browser. This is actually the style guide for the Boy Scouts of America brand style. This is a really big document. I think it's I couldn't even guess at the number of pages, but it's probably over 40. And it goes into things, just to back up a little bit, about how to use the various logos, the colors, like we did last week. So remember how you guys picked your brand colors, and you had the color codes. They have CMYK and their hex codes. They don't have the RGBs, which is surprising. But in a sense, what you are building with your mood board is a rough draft of a style guide document like this. And if we get a little farther down in the document, right here is the typefaces. These are the brand approved typefaces that they use within all of their media. And it's kind of very telling to read the little description up here where it says, what would you think if a scout dressed like this with all these sort of very casual, let me zoom in a little bit, really funky looking fonts that you might see used in, by amateur designers because they look neat or cute. The point being that that's not the look that they're going for, that they want for a scout. So they use these more traditional typefaces that capture the personality and the look of their brand. And those are Times New Roman and Arial, which are pretty classic, pretty common. Helvetica Narrow Bold, and LTC Record Title. The reason that they chose these, besides being just very traditional and formal looking, so very professional looking, also is because they are web-safe fonts. You notice that they have designations for which ones they will use for printed material, which is Times New Roman, versus online, and that's the Arial. Both of those are pretty safe, web-safe fonts, but it's always, I'll talk about it in a moment, but it's good to think about what fonts are web safe, because if you're sharing digital media, if the person opening your document or your web page doesn't have that font installed, it's not going to show up for them. So using these common fonts kind of plays it safe in that regard. And this more stylized typeface, the LTC Record Title, is used more for titles and for headers and banners, like you see right here, the official seal. So that kind of gives some context, because that's really what you're going to be doing for your own personal brand, or the brand that you're working with for your mood board project. We're working with typefaces for two basic purposes. One is, and the most basic, is the body text. This is the typeface that you would use for large pieces of content, longer passages of text. And like we saw with the Boy Scouts, this needs to be very readable and very shareable. So some of these classic typefaces, like your Arials, your Times New Romans, and Helveticas, work really well for that purpose, because it stays very clear. Some of the examples I have up here will demonstrate that, whether it's the plain sans serif or more classic serif fonts, they stay highly readable, whereas the more stylized typefaces, like you see in the two bottom examples, once you get into really long pieces of text, they become really hard to read. It can be tempting to use those because they have a very unique look, but when you're presenting content, regardless of what medium, your purpose is to be understood, to convey your message, and you don't want to undermine that by focusing more on form over function. There are the two basic classifications of typefaces, sans serif and serif. The serifs are those little extensions that come out off of the corners of the letters, and the serif fonts are more classic looking. They look a little old-fashioned, perhaps, something you might expect to see on an older document from 1800s on, whereas the sans serif lacking those. They're more blocky and more modern looking. The list you see here are some pretty common and pretty safe typefaces. These are actually system fonts. So that means they come pre-installed on most of our computers, whether it's Windows or Apple. You can go to sites like dafont.com and download tons of interesting looking typefaces, but keep in mind that if you use those in a document and you share them, it's not going to look like that to the other person. In fact, I saw that. I'm going to call you out on that, Randy, because when I opened your I think it was your mood board, it gave me a notification that there was a typeface that I didn't have. So we're going to work around that on the mood board by using graphic representations of the typefaces. If you use a PDF also, that kind of crystallizes it so that it stays consistent. It is actually sans serif. I noticed that, and I wondered if either of you would call me out on my typo there. It's sans, S-A-N-S, because that means without, sans. And that means a lot of people on the internet have been misspelling it as well, just like me. Oops. All right, so in addition to the body text that you'll be identifying, you also have, just to show you that on a website, body type would be all of the content. And this is kind of a weird example to show because the content is so broken up and small, but any of the larger passages of text, for example, on a blog, would be your body text. And then in addition to that, you have headings, headers. I believe I'm using the term header wrong on this slide as well. It should be headings. And this is just the titles, the section titles. What's good about using headings is, and you'll learn more about this in your web design course, is that it breaks up the content. It makes it easy for your reader to scan the content and find specific information and know how it's organized, what topics they're going to be exploring in that content. So you want to use these effectively in any kind of web-based or print media to make it easier and more readable for your viewer. You also want to make those headers stand out and be easily noticeable, so they need to be differentiated from your body text. So looking at this example I have up here, what error has been made there in pairing that header font or header typeface with the body typeface? This is one of the rules that was presented in your reading for this week. Yeah, that's right, Judah. And it is the fact that the two typefaces are too similar. In the reading, it recommends, like you said, pairing a serif font with a sans serif font, whether the serifs are on the header or the body. So it'd be more like this, because that gives a good contrast in the styles. It doesn't look like you accidentally left an extra typeface in there, and you can tell that you very deliberately chose those styles. As a rule of thumb, this is an easy way to go about it. It's just to always pair a sans serif with the serif. So when you're completing your mood board, you can't go wrong by picking a classic serif font for your header or headings and a sans serif for your body, or vice versa. Another option is to use a typeface like the Helvetica New family that has different text font weights available. So there's like Helvetica New Bold and Helvetica New Light and normal. So if you use the bold typeface for the header, you can use the lighter type version of it for the body. So it still gives enough differentiation, enough contrast to set it apart. Yeah, it definitely gives it a little more unity in its appearance, in my opinion. With the headers, you have a little bit more creative freedom. You can use some stylized fonts if you choose to. It's generally recommended that you not, but it can add some extra style to your media. I would say only do this if you have a very strong theme running through your media. Like some of the examples I have up here is the very 60s kind of hippie looking typeface that I always think of the Mellow Mushroom restaurant chain with this one, or the kind of digital pixelized looking typeface here if you have like a electronic gaming theme in your media or in your subject. But unless there's a good reason to do this, just don't. Just use one of the classic typefaces. And then even if you are going to do this, stay away from things that are so stylized that you can hardly read them. Yeah, just do not. And whatever you do, don't use Comic Sans or Papyrus. Exactly. And here's our headers on this particular website. Technically, the bolder pieces of text down here in the orange font would be headings as well. This would be sort of subheadings. And yeah, I think all of the websites and the articles I've reviewed for the class about rules for picking typefaces just don't use Comic Sans, even in the Lynda lessons. I don't know if Comic Sans will ever make a comeback outside of elementary school teachers making posters. And the third use of typefaces for branding is the display text. And this is the really stylized and unique typefaces that become integral parts of a brand. Usually they're used in logos, as you see here. and are recognizable. If you saw that typeface, you would know the brand immediately, even if it didn't say Disney or Coca-Cola. Those are iconic. So this is another option. And in fact, if you want to add one of these to your mood board, you can. Again, only do this if you have a good reason to. If you plan on having a really distinctive typeface that becomes recognizable, almost sort of the trademark of your brand's identity. And if you do use these, again, these are not for body type at all. These would only be in logos, in banners, in headings or headers, like the banners across the top of your websites, and so on. Any questions so far? All right. And I'm going to get into our other big topic for the week, which is visual hierarchy, which in some ways is well, no, I wouldn't say it's more important, but it is definitely an important topic to be aware of. But first, I want to go over a few typography don'ts. This is really just things to not do when you're working with text. And this is not covered in any of the readings this week, but just some rules that I just wanted to throw out there, just because some things that I see often. One, and I touched on this already, is form over function. And this is a common pitfall. And this is the reason why you don't use your more decorative text for body content. Functionality is key on any kind of media. You want to deliver that message. So the example you see here, where they've used the really stylized looking Southwestern typeface for the entire menu design, it becomes unreadable. Whereas using the very classic, probably Helvetica, I think, typeface makes it very neat, very orderly, and very presentable. So only use those decorative typefaces for accents and to create a theme, but then from there just let it go back into the more traditional look. Don't use too many typefaces. This is probably the most common error I see. As a general rule, no more than 2 on any given piece of media, unless you're using typefaces to create art or some special purpose like that. Use 1 for your body, maybe a second for your headings, and that's it. Otherwise, it looks very cluttered, very messy, and not at all like a professional piece of media. Contrast is vital, especially if you're working with putting text over images. Always make sure that you have effective contrast between your typeface color and the background color. And this can be tricky if the image is really busy and has different colors and values that the text is going to go over. But if you work with the font color a bit, you'll find something that works. There's the common temptation to put light lettering over a dark background, but that can be okay, but it's not considered optimum. And then this example up in the upper right is an example of very low contrast, where it becomes very hard to read. And you also don't want any of these very jarring color combinations that are kind of will burn out your retinas looking at. If you have the option, always go with dark lettering over a white background. Usually black text is fine. I've read articles saying that a darker gray, and so it's a little bit softer, is actually better, especially for readers who have dyslexia. So it's a little bit of a accessibility concern. And this next one is one that isn't often addressed, but it's really important. And I see this come up from time to time, and that's association. Take a look at this image. This is something I stumbled upon on the internet at some point, and I had to keep it because this is such a good example. How would you read this if you were reading this message? Like, how would you instinctively read that? Okay, yeah, Randy said you felt like your eye was leaping across a chasm. We instinctively group things together based on how closely associated they are, their proximity to one another. And also we are taught to read in straight lines of text from left to right. And so when you arrange things in this way, it totally breaks all of those natural habits that we have developed. Even having this division between the two images with very different color schemes creates that separation. So you would expect this to be a title and then text and then title and text. But the way they've done this is it should be read Arctic fox. The white fox has been given the name due to its coat. I would instinctively read this as this white fox has been given which is white predominantly, which is completely nonsensical. So don't do this. Just let the text go across the screen if you're going to convey this message. And I think this might have been one of yours, Judah, but I can't remember for sure. Yeah. And this struck me as something of an example of this. In this case, they've actually salvaged it by using the color associations. So that differentiates the title, Capture the Flag. But also look at how the red text reads. The Stars and Stripes in American History, Arnaldo Testi. There is no differentiation of that author's name, so it almost looks like it's a continuous line of text. And then I took away the color in this example just to show how without that differentiation, it becomes harder to tell how that should be read. It could be Capture the Stars, the and flag stripes, but that makes no sense. And another example from the exploration. This one's a little clearer, but by inserting this line, it kind of plays with the natural flow of how we would read this. This line, this part of the title should appear after what Obama means, but they have inserted it into an kind of unintuitive location there. So the point being that you should always consider how we naturally read, and that will influence how we interpret media as well, even if it's not just a document. If we're not just reading a paper, but it's a design like this, we're still going to have a habit of entering from the left at the top and kind of reading line by line until we reach the bottom. These are some examples that actually work with that same idea. If this was actually had in mind that this would be sort of a magazine title or a title of a document of some kind that reads "Ready for Liftoff," with this first one being not the optimal choice, because the "ready for" is right justified, so it breaks that natural rule of reading from left to right. And then same thing here, because now it's out of order. We're reading top to bottom as we do in the English language. So best case is to just take advantage of how we have been taught from childhood how to read. And this one is going to be perhaps an unpopular rule, but no text effects, none. Unless you are a well-trained graphic artist and can apply a drop shadow in a way that is aesthetically pleasing, just don't use these, because they are a huge red flag that you're new at this. So it's better to just stick with very traditional and clean typefaces in your work. And Photoshop has some new features that let you do 3D projections and effects on your text, and I almost wish they hadn't added that in, because I see it misused too often. So until you really have got a hang of that, you can use it when you're practicing and playing around, but in your final products, just avoid that. Any thoughts on any of those rules so far? Yes, good rules to follow. Those are really some basic rules, but just things to keep in mind, and that will help you avoid some common pitfalls. So the last thing I want to talk about is the topic of visual hierarchy, and this is one of the fundamental aspects of composition and layout. Our purpose is to create a very well-planned experience for our viewers. We want to, as I say time and again, we don't want to leave anything to chance. We want to know exactly how our audience is going to take in our media designs and the impression that they're going to get from it. And visual hierarchy is our way of giving them a guided tour. It tells them what order, where to look and what order to look there. Really quickly, I want to just kind of give a quick definition of what a hierarchy is. And you guys might know this, but sometimes I'll see comments in the exploration activities and so on that kind of make me realize that perhaps this is not a term that everybody has been exposed to. So a hierarchy is simply an ordering, a classification of things in their relative importance. So perhaps the classic hierarchy is that of medieval European society, where you had the king, and below the king were the nobles, and then below the nobles were the knights that served them, and then at the very bottom were the peasants that kind of worked the land and were ruled by all these higher social statuses. So typically in a hierarchy, the higher up on the hierarchy, the fewer individuals there are. So you get to the top, you have the king, he's the ruler. And if it's a company, then you have the CEO or the president. A visual hierarchy then would be an ordering or a ranking of visual elements by order of importance. So at the top of that hierarchy, you would have the most dominant element. And when I say dominant, I mean that thing that captures your attention, that has the strongest draw on your eye. So your eye immediately goes there. And then from there, you have subdominant elements that will be noticed next. And then after that is the subordinate details that maybe you'll notice if you really pay attention, but they're just there for scenery. Or if it's a document, then the details will just be the bulk of the content, with your dominant elements being your title and then subdominant being the subheadings. Here's an example. Just looking at this, immediately, what is the dominant element in this poster design? And Randy says the cup. And that's right. Why is that? The color sets it apart, and that is, of course, a complementary color relationship. So the blue background lets that orange cup really pop out. So it is almost a 3D effect with it floating there. But it's, there's no doubt what is going to be the dominant element. So what would be the next on the hierarchy? What would be down here in this sort of goldenrod level, on the second highest level? Okay, and in which text in particular? Yeah, so it would be a perfect blend, which I believe is the name of a cafe, if I'm reading this correctly. But the tagline, and then Randy says followed by the date, which would be our next layer. So there's that hierarchy: the cup, the title, and the title is large, but it has very low color contrast. So they've intentionally made that less dominant in order to create that hierarchy. And that's really the important factor, is that you're doing this deliberately. You're you've decided the cup is going to be dominant, so I made that dominant by giving it the color contrast. I decided that this would come next, so I made it large, but not as prominent in terms of color. And then the date, and also this plaza logo, which I think is the location, would probably be close rankings as far as the third layer, with Katie Day and pianist, the musical guest, being written in that white font that really stands out. So has a little bit of color contrast, not as much as the cup, and is smaller than the perfect blend. And then this last layer would be all the other details, which I didn't color code, but only after you've noticed all these things will you then take in all that information, if you're interested enough to spend the time. So it is the responsibility of these dominant elements to create that interest, catch your viewer's eye and draw them in. In the article that was assigned this week, they say that visual hierarchy can be communicated through use of color contrast, which we saw, texture differences, which we don't really see here, but would come into play if the texture played a part in the design. So if you had like a consistent texture and then suddenly there was something different, then it stands out. Relative shape and size. So that's what sets the perfect blend apart from the other text. Position, which I'll show some examples of in a minute, and orientation as well. What it really comes down to is things that are different will stand out, because our brains are geared to look for patterns and look for consistency, and when something is inconsistent, we notice it. It really catches our eye. A couple from the exploration. This one was Randy's. In both cases, the imagery is what is dominant. So the light bulb, because it's big and has color contrast, or value contrast in this case, it's either, the cord is very dark, the bulb is very light. Both of those things stand out. And because of the size of it, it makes it attract our eye more readily than the words. And in this case, just because it's a darker background, the lighter wording gets the higher ranking on the hierarchy. If it was a really light background, of course, it would be the other way around, but then the author is third. And here they're using that kind of visceral design aspect of using faces to communicate emotion to get our attention, and that's what's given the most attention here, followed by the title, and the author in this case is almost sort of an afterthought. Okay, and Randy made a comment that he found that he would change his mind on what's prominent the longer he stared at it, and I think that's probably true in some cases. And a lot of times the effective designs will be the ones that you notice. No, I'm not saying that right. That will happen because you've had time to really process what you're looking at, as opposed to just that immediate split-second reaction of what catches your eye. So once you've maybe had time to assign significance to it based on rational thought and interpretation, then things become more important. Yeah, okay. And yeah, I didn't include that book cover for The Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk. Kind of wish I had, but But yeah, in that case, and I think maybe it's just that the title and the airplane graphic had a very close visual weight, where it was kind of you could call it either way. But to me, what made the difference was the lines were all pointing to the airplane. And the color will always play a big part, and the more vibrant colors will become your immediate draw as far as your visual attention goes. So we would enter this, our starting point would be thrilling tales, because that's so exciting, and with those warm colors against that cool background, of course, that pops out to us. And that goes really hand in hand with the red jacket. So those two elements. And I ranked the Thrilling Tales title first, highest on the hierarchy, but I think in this case it's a pretty close call between those two. And so only after we take in those, then we move on to perhaps the editor and then the other details. It's similar to what we saw with the Watchmen, with that Watchmen title really grabbing our attention against the darker, cool color background. A technique that you can use to make something more dominant than it normally would be is to isolate it. Use white space or empty space to kind of frame it and let it sit there by itself, which we see with the child on the boat in this book cover, because they've put this, is that sort of the vignette filter from Instagram, kind of that effect on here, to where there's shadows all around, but that bright color really allows us to, or really calls our attention to that spot and helps to build contrast. So if that person was against, if they had left the image in the same style as the rest of the cover, it would not have stood out as much. So then that becomes our dominant element, with the title becoming subdominant and moving to the author. Similar here, where the text is framed in this negative space created by the buildings. And I believe this was Eric's from class, and he made the comment that that it was interesting that while the author is slightly smaller font, the color allows it to become more dominant. And I can definitely see that being the case. It's, in fact, which of these would you call the most dominant element, the title or the author? So often color wins out over size. Okay, and so Randy went with the title. Author. So I think this, judging by our reactions here, maybe this one is one where it's really a tie, and it's up to the individual perception. Yeah, the value contrast in this case would be stronger between the sky and the title. And when I say value, that's the relative lightness and darkness of it. And just to be clear, this idea of visual hierarchy applies in practically every kind of visual media, including photography, but especially in web design, where it's one of the fundamental skills that come into play. And you will make use of your levels of headings from level 1 through 4 or 6, I believe it goes in HTML. But the idea is that, again, you're giving your viewers a guided tour. You tell them to start here and then go from there to the next spot and to the next spot as they explore the website. Yeah, Four Rivers is popular here in Orlando, I know. As a vegetarian, I can't attest to its quality, but a lot of people I know seem to be pretty fanatical about it. And the same rules apply. You're using size, color contrast, location, and white space or negative space to tell your viewers where they should look first. This is that accented achromatic color scheme that we looked at last week, and it has a very strong effect on visual hierarchy. Because now we have these 3 spots: the word design, which tells us what they do, the little call to action, the register now, and the main content area. And I have a couple of counter examples to look at. And I'd be curious to hear your reactions to these. And I'm not sure if either of these were either of yours, but these were from the exploration. And let's look at everything is illuminated there. Like, where is the entry point? Where do you start with something like this? Super busy. First, our natural inclination is to start in the upper left and read from left to right and down. There's really no differentiation between the title and the author. And then you have that little tiny, the small text squeezed in there. So really almost meant to be very clumsy looking in its presentation. And the Cormac McCarthy cover has something of a hierarchy, although it's not really well defined. I'd say the author's name stands out more just because of that contrast. It's so stark white. And then moving on to the large print of the title. This one's breaking the rule of too many typefaces, isn't it? But probably purposely done. And when you look at these, notice where they put the emphasis. It really tells you what the publisher felt was more important. In some cases, the author has some name recognition behind him, like Cormac McCarthy, who's known for the book The Road, which was made into a film, and so would be seen as more of the selling point. Whereas if it's a lesser known author, then the title of the book might be more of a selling point to sell the concept. And visual hierarchy is a way that you, as a designer, can make those calls. And Jay, you said you started on the top left, which you thought was weird considering how busy it is. It is weird um, in the fact that there's nothing telling you where to start, but since that's how we're trained to read, um, in English reads, then that would be the natural place. That would be the default. And this last one I wanted to include just because it's so bad. If you guys have, I don't know how old you all are in comparison to me, but I at least was around in the early days of web design when GeoCities was still a thing and allowed anyone to create their own websites. And really that's what this is imitating, and it's purposely imitating it with the tiled background image with the unicorn and the poorly formatted HTML text. But yeah, it's so bad it's good, and that's very much what this is going for. So this is purposely horrible design. And so until you know the rules, don't do this. Until you know the rules well enough to know how to break them. Let this be a counterexample for you, a warning to you. Yes, and Randy, you have brought up GIFs a couple of times. Do you have an aversion to them? I actually once was asked to redesign a school's website for them, and the original site had been built by one of the faculty members and had a multitude of dancing bear GIFs, animated GIFs, that just had to go. So I think, Randy, your head would have exploded. And so this is visual hierarchy. And visual hierarchy is not going to play a part on your mood board directly, aside from you putting in some forethought into how you're going to use heading text versus body text. But don't forget this information, because coming up soon, you're going to get into digital video, you're going to get into graphic design, web design, and even project management, where you're going to put together documents. And all this is going to come into play. You're going to want to decide where your focus is going to be first, and then how you're going to move through that document or move through that scene in a video in order to take in the message that it's trying to deliver. And back on the topic of GIFs, yeah, everyone used to say never use animated GIFs. GIFs were good for web graphics for putting together a website because they tended to be lower file size, but the animation was an annoyance. Nowadays, I see them a lot used on social media, especially on Tumblr, to show basically to replace short video segments, just probably for the sake of bandwidth. I don't know if I still don't think they're that well respected, though. They're still pretty much something that you see kids using on their Tumblr pages. All right, any thoughts or questions on any of the content from this week? Okay, and something that I probably should have said at the beginning of class, but with the mood board projects, as I give feedback, go ahead and make corrections and revisions to your mood board. Because as I review each week's new additions, I'm actually looking back at what you did the previous weeks. And if you see in my feedback, you can earn back some points if there were any deductions. So make those revisions. The idea is that the idea of a mood board is that you would be sharing it with someone, either a client or a team member or a project manager, and sharing your ideas in that way, and you can get their input and their approval if you need approval. And then sometimes it'll be a back and forth between you and the client until you get it just right. So I'm kind of playing the role of the client, even though this is your personal brand. And so I'm saying, give me some more information. So from your standpoint, you should take the mindset of assuming I know nothing, and you have to give me all the context for all these images and all these color schemes and so forth. So keep that in mind as you're putting together your mood board. Other than that, that's what I had prepared for tonight, and I appreciate you guys both joining me again, and wish you a good evening.